This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager.
Welcome to Wagon Wheel. I'm Jarrod Kimber. We are doing the podcast where we answer questions from the audience. We started with the Patreon questions, of course, today. And if you have anything for super chats, you can put them in this room. And if it's not super chats, you can also just put in normal questions, and I can try and get to those as well. Please, if you enjoy the podcast and all the different shows that we do, please go out and like and subscribe. We've got the Jarrod Kimber podcast channel now. We'll be looking to make more and more content over there, but we need more subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed to Jarrod Kimber podcast, please go and find that. But also, if you're listening to this in iTunes or Spotify or whatever, Podcast Addict, whatever your thing is, please rate, review, subscribe, all those different things. They help us massively. So thank you to everyone who does, but mostly thank you to the Patreon people who pay to ask questions. Well, not always. Sometimes they pay and they don't ask questions. Sometimes they ask multiple questions. Depends on their moods. But let us start with Manan, who says, is Rashids ODI record something like Sky's, that it almost feels like a fluke, that they aren't doing better, will eventually return to the norm? It feels like Rashid needs to trust himself more and make a better play him instead of trying to do too much. Look, I just think there is a part of T20 cricket where you can't sit back and wait with Rashid, right? And so you are, even if you get a bad ball, he's probably already got you into a bad physical position. He's probably already beaten you once or twice, and you're trying to play big shots to him. T20 cricket, one-day cricket's just a little bit different. You can milk a little bit more, and so it is a different skill set. There's a reason why we don't see as many, wrist spinners completely dominate one-day cricket the way we do in T20 cricket. And it's the really ultra aggressive shots. Like if you watch a leg spinner, even if you see like a bad, leg spinner in club cricket, if they're really ripping the ball, and even if they bowl a full toss or a half tracker, there's still a chance of them getting a wicket. And it's because of the revolutions that they are putting on the ball. And so when you're trying to play that attacking shot, obviously your head moves a little bit and you make mistakes and all those sorts of things. That's just going to happen a lot more in T20 cricket than it is in one-day cricket, where you're waiting a little bit more. So I haven't looked at his record, Manan, to be fair. So I don't know exactly what the situation is of recent times. I know, he obviously dominated at the lower levels of one-day internationals and maybe struggled a little bit more. I didn't think he always bowled brilliantly in the last World Cup, but he has the skills to be able to do it. But it's we talk about this for batters all the time. It's exactly the same thing for the spin bowlers, right? Or any bowlers. Because it's a different length and because it's a different tempo, there are just little changes that you need to make, and perhaps he hasn't made them enough. But as I said, I haven't seen the record enough to make big assumptions on it. Christopher says, a narrative around the 100 is that it isn't designed for certain cricket fans, such as members, badges, and existing fans who go regularly. Is that acceptable? You wouldn't see that in the Premier League, the NFL, and the NBA. You kind of do. This is the interesting thing about Big Bash and the 100 specifically, is that they're just a little bit more honest. Most sporting leagues are set up for, football's a little bit different. So the NFL and Premier League, you could certainly take those out. But most sporting leagues are set up for casual fans, because chances are you don't have enough hardcore fans to be able to make your money. Casual fans they're the dream of any league or team or nation. Really, it's how many of those can you come in? You hope that you can transfer some of them to hardcore fans, but most things are actually not set up for hardcore fans of that particular sport, because they're going to come anyway because they love the sport. And so what the 100 has done is it's weirdly a little bit more honest with that, but also because they're so honest with that, it makes them look a little bit stupid at times. So I think, and also part of that is, if you're building a new sport from scratch, it's very hard for you to say, well, we're going to build it on existing fans, because there wasn't existing fans of any of these teams, right? They did not exist before. They were non-existent fans. And so, I think because of it's a new league and it's a little bit different, but I think even if you look back at the IPL, again, it was made to be slightly more for casual fans than anything else. What I would say is that you do eventually get to a point in these situations, and someone who's done this for a very long time and watch new leagues and new things crop up every now and again. The one thing I would argue is that the hardcore fans actually, their excitement and their fanaticism does build a lot of what the casual fans are interested in. So especially in this social media age, but it was even beforehand, the old water cooler age. But in the social media age of literally having a situation where your friends are tweeting or on threads or putting TikToks out about cricket more often is more important. That is generally going to be hardcore fans. So you do have to factor them in. And I think in the hundredth case, they're probably gone too far. But if you go to an NBA game, they just pump music all the way through because they're terrified that you're going to be bored. Every break in play, even if it's like 3 minutes, there's someone out on the floor dancing or throwing a t-shirt or trying to get a half-court shot in. Like the NBA is completely set up for casual fans, and the basketball fans just have to, enjoy the game. Will says, what would a team need to succeed in ODI cricket with ultra-aggressive bowling tactics? We're going to let you score at 8 and over because we back ourselves to get you all out in 30 overs. I just don't think that exists, Will, because I don't think the bowlers exist. It's partly the balls as well. So those balls by the 12th over mark are not really going to be helping spinners or pace bowlers. That they will not swing. They generally don't seem. You get a little bit of spin, but the ball would have already started to get soft because they're pathetic balls. If you were doing this with a red ball team, then yeah, perhaps you could pick the 5 best strike bowlers. But I would say, like, what teams in the world ever have 5 strike bowlers that you would say would be able to regularly bowl teams out in 30 overs? I don't think those kinds of bowlers really exist in the wild. So even if you got them another ball, I can't see how that would be the case. I get the theory behind it. So, like, if you had, this is the thing. Even if you look at the best strike bowlers in one-day cricket, it's actually, I think you'd be shocked at sort of how little they strike. So one thing I was always looking for, of course, is the T20 strike bowlers in the power play, because that's the most important time to strike. But when you do go and have a look at it, you actually don't see that many players who are consistently taking wickets at like an average of 18 or 19, because once they get good, teams start to stop attacking them, right? And they do change the way they play. And I think because of that, strike bowlers don't exist as much in one-day cricket as you would think. What you end up getting is maybe you've got a bowler who can strike with a brand new ball, but then he doesn't strike very well in the middle. And then you've got another bowler who might be a really good striker at the end, but doesn't have the ability to actually take early wickets all that much. And so I do think that's a very, very different situation to be in. I just want to have a look at the top 100 wicket takers of all time in ODI cricket, just to see if I can prove my point here. He says, well, his internet's gone down. But yeah, strike rate here. So you've got, if you take out some of the older bowlers like Lamachane, who obviously hasn't bowled to as many great players, Mendes, Rashid Mendes, who was a mystery spinner and then disappeared, Rashid Khan, again, bowled. So the best strike bowlers of all time are Stark, Muhammad Shami, Trent Bolt, Mustafizur, Shane Bond, Brett Lee, Matt Henry, right? Those are the guys in the history of ODI cricket who take 2 wickets per innings. And really what you are looking for is 5 of them, right? Because you want 10 wickets. Well, you want actually even more than that, don't you? So you can see here, even the most attacking players of all time. Now, as you've rightly pointed out, they're not going all out to attack at the moment. But I really don't think there are a bunch of bowlers out there who have the ability to suddenly up that to a certain level, because there just aren't that many bowlers who consistently strike in one-day internationals. It's a really interesting question, though. Aditya says, in last week's Uncovered podcast, you rated India higher than Pakistan when it comes to World Cup favorites. What are the factors you see that put India higher than them? The only area I think India can score substantially higher is spin. Certainly, I mean, that's a massive thing, because the series is going to be in India, right? So you've got I would say they have 3 bowlers who, when all things considered, I am considering the all-round part of it in India, rate probably as high or if not higher than Pakistan. The only bowler that you might use ahead of an Indian spinner might be Shadab, but I think he's kind of a third spinner / all-rounder in that kind of side. Kuldeep is a much better strike bowler than him. I've said this before. Shadab's not particularly good, a strike bowler in one-day cricket. Rizwan is not Rizwan, Nawaz, sorry. Rizwan probably won't do very well with the ball. Nawaz is not particularly good with, he's not really a frontline bowler. He's, more of a secondary spinner / give you a little bit of batting. So, maybe at best they have the third best spinner and the 5th best spinner, right? And that's a big drop. It's a big drop. And, especially because this is going to be played in India. Then you've also got the fact that, I think Jadeja is the strongest all round of the spinners there. There's not a huge drop off with pace bowling. I think Pakistan's pace bowling is better, but Jasprit Bumrah exists, right? And is a more constant threat all the way through. And as I've just said, Mohammad Shami is one of the best strike bowlers in one-day internationals. So there's not a huge drop off there, although Pakistan probably have more options that they can throw at that problem. Hardik Pandya, it gives you seam bowling overs in your top 6. Jadeja could give you, proper frontline bowling options in your top 6. So the all-rounder thing, if you're comparing that to Nawaz and Fahim, I mean, that's a big drop off there. Batting, not as much as anything else. And then the final thing is it's home conditions, right? So I think from that perspective, I think that India should be on a slightly higher road. The only other thing I would say is I believe that India has the chance, and a lot of this depends on how they play, but I think India can outbat teams and outbowl teams. I don't think the way that Pakistan play one-day cricket, they traditionally try and outbat teams, so they're only giving themselves one chance of that. But the Pakistan team's still a very good chance, which is you're talking about, the tiers. And if you have a look at the odds of winning the tournament, it's already starting to show you what the way that the market is trying to look at different teams. And I do think that you'd be hard pressed to say that India isn't, a slightly elevated side over Pakistan. Having said that, in that Uncovered podcast, I hadn't done my full research yet. So I'll be going through all this very, very soon. Value bet is probably Sri Lanka, by the way, if you're betting out there. Avi says, how serious do you think Sophie Eccleston's shoulder injury is compared to other shoulder injuries? So most shoulder injuries for bowlers and spinners are, from constant usage, right? So you are, it's an unnatural act, right? We see it with baseball pitchers, with their elbows, and, with spinners, we see the fingers, sometimes the wrists, although not as much, the elbow and the shoulder. You're rotating those parts of your body, or you're putting stress on those parts of your body. Sophie Eccleston's interesting because as far as I'm aware, and my memory of this, it was a dislocation, which is not a spinner's injury. And I'm not saying spinners have never happened before. I would say that the one bowler that comes to mind instantly was probably someone like Jeff Thompson, who obviously injured his shoulder and was never quite the same kind of bowler afterwards, but he still had a professional career. He didn't disappear or anything. I can't think of a spin bowler who's dislocated their shoulder. I'm not to say that has never happened before. I would think that is a very bad injury for a spin bowler to have. I'm trying to think if I think it would be worse for a finger spinner, but I'd need to talk to some of my finger spin nerds to see if that is the case. I don't think it means the end, because we don't know how bad the dislocation was or how it will affect her and everything else. But off the top of my head, I would say that's a very bad injury. But I think it's very different than, say, Graham Swan's elbow is a perfect example, or Shane Warne's finger, or those sorts of things, which is just overuse, and that those things are probably never going to come back to the same way that they were before, and that's always going to be have to be something that the bowlers are going to have to deal with, whether they bowl within themselves or whatever that may be. Eccleston's may not be like that, so it may be separate from sort of traditional spinners' injuries in that way. Will says, how do you envisage a post-Stokes England doing, given how his body looks at the moment? I doubt he has long left. I mean, that looks very fair. Who are some other figures that have had as significant an impact on a team, and what happened after they retired? Look, it all depends on what you have coming up, right? Like Garfield Sobers. When is Garfield Sobers' last test? There's no way to replace Garfield Sobers. And so when Garfield Sobers leaves, West Indies haven't really had another all-rounder anywhere near that ability. But he retires in 1974, and they get pretty good after that, right? So some of that is dumb luck, and, Clive Lloyd changing the way that they went about their cricket and everything else. But still, like, you've lost probably the most all-round great player of all time, in that, he gives you spin, he gives you seam, he can field anywhere, and he can probably bat anywhere from 4 to 6, maybe even 3. He probably could have batted at 3, but now we're getting into the Sobers thing. So they recover really well. But look at South Africa. South Africa haven't. And what the big problem with South Africa is that they kept trying to replace. South Africa did what Moneyball tells you to do. Right, it's a really, really interesting one here. South Africa basically tried to replace Callis in the aggregate, right? Of going, well, what we really need to do is replace a fifth bowler. So we might not have one bowler who's strong enough to be the fifth bowler, but if we have Ryan McLaren in the side and we have Robin Peterson in the side, between the two of them on the right day, they are our fifth bowler. And then obviously neither of those can bat as good, but if we have McLaren batting at 6 and Peterson batting at 7 or 8, again, we have the ability to get a little bit more batting into the side and everywhere else. So what actually happens there is that Peterson and McLaren's batting is just doesn't cut the mustard. New Zealand, who are we talking about? South Africa spend ages trying to replace that kind of player, and they can't. And you've seen that both of them is probably a really good example of a team trying to replace that style of player, when actually perhaps what they would have been better off doing in that period would have been going, there isn't another all-rounder like in both of them. Perhaps our best choice at the moment is to go back to 6 batters and 4 bowlers and a wicket keeper, rather than trying to do that, or do the Australia / I suppose a little bit of England, Zimbabwe thing of going, well, our all-rounder is actually our wicket keeper, and then perhaps England could have done something like that, bat their wicket keeper slightly higher and tried to replace both of them in that kind of way. So yeah, I think Hadley might be another one of when Hadley disappears, New Zealand go from one of the best teams in the world to really not. They really, really struggle. I did a podcast with Danny Morrison. I don't think people realize how bad they were in that sort of early 90 period in Test cricket, perhaps because they were good in one-day cricket at time around that period, but they really, really struggled. So, it really just depends on what your team is, what the other options are. If Sam Curran gets to a point where he can average 30 with the bat, batting at number 7 or 8, and probably batting at number 7, that gives him a little bit of flexibility, right? If him or Wokes can't do those roles and can't take wickets consistently at home and away, or don't make the sort of runs that they need to, well, England need to look at a completely different plan. A lot of their plans over the last 7 or 8 years was around having multiple all-rounders, which meant that they had longer batting lineups and that they could be more flexible with their bowling lineups. That probably isn't going to be the case going ahead, right? So again, maybe you can't take risks if Ollie Robinson can't bowl his 3rd spell, right? All those sorts of things come into play, and that's what players like Stokes, Botham, Callis, Sobers do as all-rounders. Now, part of this, England is already in that period with Stokes, so it's already starting to happen. And that's a really interesting thing as well. Maybe late stage Imran Khan, although he's still bowling, isn't he? Even Vittori's bowling sort of falls off a cliff a little bit, I think, towards the end of his career, but his batting steps up so much. Unless Stokes can pick up his batting, there's already going to be a lag even before Stokes goes. Ben says, in the build-up to the second New Zealand T20, Sky team talked about the umpires in domestic cricket having mini Hawkeye cams on them so that every domestic delivery is tracked. How can this help player development and selection? So I wrote about this when the BCCI were thinking about bringing Hawkeye in, and that was a more traditional Hawkeye for their domestic cricket. And I said it would be that would be the ball game when it comes to data. The smaller teams just are not going to be able to afford to be able to do that. And the BCCI sort of still pissing about it a little bit with that idea. But they want to fix the umpiring. That's not what you need to fix. What you need to work out is how much more information can you have about your players than anyone else is ever going to be able to get about them. I talked to Major League Cricket about these Hawkeye cameras. So the umpires are wearing them on their chest. I was told about them by the guys at Intelligent Cricket. So I went straight to Major League Cricket and said, put them on all your minor league players and you're going to have more information on every cricketer coming through in America than most of the major teams ever will. They didn't end up going down that path. They went down, separate paths. And then, of course, county cricket has brought them in. There's a lot of problems with them. One, it's an extra job for the analyst, which essentially at that stage means it's a bit of a faff for them. Two, the umpires don't all stand exactly straight, and it causes huge problems when they don't do that. Three, not all the umpires have perfectly flat bellies. And because it hangs like sort of middle of your chest sort of region, if you have a bit of a belly, it can be warped a little bit. So it's not like normal Hawkeye. You can't trust it as much as normal Hawkeye because of those reasons. But it's cheaper. It could be used all around the world. The stuff I've seen from it, so I must have been shown it about a year ago. It was good, and I almost think it was good in a way of, my first thought was, well, maybe we can at least get some basic Hawkeye stuff from it, but it's not foolproof. I think the company, I forget the name of the company who've got their devices, they would admit that it's not foolproof yet. But if you're a cricket team and you're trying to get an advantage over everyone else, it's huge. A really, really big advantage from that perspective. I haven't read Athas's piece, actually. CS just sent it to me, but I didn't get a chance to read it before we came on. Rudra says, 2000s India question. Oh, hello. How would a hypothetical four-man left-arm pace attack of Zahir Khan, Api Singh, Ashish Nira, and Irfan Pathan do, assuming that they're all fit in the same game? What would be their best format? I would have thought, based on that, you'd probably be looking. I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but I would have thought that was a one-day format that they would be good at. Yeah, the whole thing with the four, and I assume part of the reason you're asking this, you would never ask this question, Rudra, if they were all right arm, right? And so I find it absolutely fascinating. I remember when Pakistan, I think Pakistan had 3 left-arm seamers in their attack for England, and they certainly did it at other times. But I remember the English press go, it's too many left-arm seamers. So we almost always have too many right-arm seamers. What are we talking about here? Like, it's such a weird thing to think that, oh, no, you've got too much of this other thing. If you're 4 of your best 5 bowlers are left-arm seamers and you've got an injury, you're going to pick them. It's very rare that your best 4 bowlers would be left-arm seamers at the same time. So, maybe Irfan, not Irfan. Irfan's in this side, isn't he? Maybe, who am I thinking of? Maybe there was 1 or 2 other seamers that were around that were right arm. Ishant Sharma's probably the guy I'm thinking of, actually, isn't it? That are around at that stage to, slightly break that up. But yeah, I think that when you have 2 bowlers that are very similar, you might go with 1 extra left armer just because, it does give your team flexibility. I think in matchup situations, we see, Jason Behrendorff playing in the 2019 World Cup because of England's problems with left arm seamers at that point. So, there are some times when you might make it tactical. There are other times where it might just be, we've got 4 really good bowlers here. One of them's left arm. Even if, we think he's maybe not quite as good as the other ones, we might bring him in. It would be the same with 4 left arm bowlers, right? If you have 4 left arm seamers and you're playing in an area where you need to use 4 seamers, you would probably look at that lineup and you would think to yourself, what the opposition, what can they do? And then on top of that, you'd be like, for variation, is there a right arm seamer who is roughly at the level of one of these other players? that's the decisions you should be making. You should never think to yourself, "Oh, we've got too much left arm seam." And generally, the best players in the world are the best players in the world because of how good they are against the right arm seam. Very few, it's almost impossible to find a player with a weakness for right arm seam, right? Whereas left arm seam, you're probably going to get 2 or 3 players in any lineup that are going to struggle with it, right? So bowling too much of it is very rarely an issue. There might be some issues on certain kinds of tracks or against certain kinds of lineups, or they might be too similar to each other, which happens with right arm seamers, all those sorts of things. But just picking them, I wouldn't have a problem. Looking at those 4, kind of think that, and I'm trying to remember back 4 different players' records off the top of my head, but I would have thought that that looks like a pretty good one-day lineup. I certainly wouldn't, my memory was that India did really well with left arm seam in one-day cricket over a long period of time. And I'm assuming those are the 4 guys that probably did the majority of the damage. Patrick says, who are Australia's best 5 pacers for the World Cup? Well, Mitchell Starc is probably their best pacer. I would say now that Hazelwood is their second best pacer. In one-day cricket, Pat Cummins is still very, very effective, certainly better than he is in T20 cricket. So there's your 3. I'd probably have Jai Richardson at 4. Not brilliantly tested, but certainly, very good. And then at the 5th one, I suppose you could throw. I'd have to have a deeper look at the reserves, but would Spencer Johnson be a chance at the moment? Right? Like, it's possible, isn't it? We haven't seen him enough in one-day cricket. He's not very, very well tested. Gives you an extra left arm option. And then, of course, you've got Behrendorff, who I think is a very, very good new ball bowler. Alice, who I think is probably more suited to T20 cricket. And then you've got the sort of the older options that have been around for a long time, sort of Richardson and, I'm trying to think of some of the other guys that that have sort of been around or on the fringes a little bit from that perspective. But yeah, I think I suppose you'd go depending on. I'm trying to think. Is Behrendorff your best option in India? Because you can swing the ball around nicely for a couple of overs, and Spencer Johnson might need a little bit more pace and bounce in the wicket. I don't know. I think those are the guys that I'd be looking at. Also, for the World Cup, Australia has some flexibility now with some of the all-round options that they have available to them as well. So you can maybe take a flyer on someone like Spencer Johnson if you wanted to. Ben says, if franchise tournaments implemented a fee that goes to associate countries when their player gets picked, potentially a percentage of their fee goes to the country. I think I wrote about that 14 years ago. Still hasn't happened, but hey, without taking anything away from the players, how would that help associate nations? You could argue that this sort of thing could be done right across, all international cricket, not just the associate nations. No, it'd be massive. We saw that the county teams got a kickback from county players when they played in the IPL. So that's slightly different to what you're talking about, but a similar kind of thing. But if you think of, let's have a look. Let's say Scotland or Namibia got in and they got 2 players into, they had 1 player who played all around the world and maybe another player who played half the time. And their overall earnings for the year maybe is, let's say, £200,000 or $200,000, sorry. And you were saying that you would get 20% of that back, right? And then you've got another player doing half that, maybe playing 100,000. You're now looking at a full-time staff member, in some cases, maybe even 2 interns that could help you all the way through the year. That a lot of these teams don't have, anyone traveling with them outside of a coach, maybe an assistant coach, maybe one other person like a strength and conditioning or a physio person. Instantly, you'd be looking at being able to pay for 1 extra staff member every year. And then if you had a few players playing, it would be huge. Those sorts of things are really, really important. The wages that associate teams can pay their staff is quite poor. Everyone's looking for their bigger job all the time. The ability to be able to do that, perhaps the Hawkeye cameras that we were talking about before that go on your chest for the umpires, perhaps some other technology that Scottish cricket or Namibian cricket could use. Pay for a full-time analyst, or maybe pay for like 4 or 5 part-time analysts to get more ideas coming into the side all the time. All those things would be available under that kind of a system, Ben. It will not happen. But yeah, all those things are available. Anyway, we'll take a break here on the Uncovered podcast. I am still Jarrod Kimber, and I will be back after the break to do a few more Patreon questions. And remember, if you're in the YouTube channel and you're desperate to chat, please send through a super chat.
This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager.
Your support is invaluable to us, so smash that subscribe button like a fast bowler back of a length. Or you could leave a comment, something along the lines of, "Wow, Jarrod, you're one hell of a swinger." Furthermore, help us reach more people by sharing our work on social media, supporting us on Patreon, or sending live super chats. Celebrate your cricket heroes with Bodyline t-shirts. Explore their player-inspired tees, featuring legends like Sachin Tendulkar, Brian Lara, and Viv Richards. They also have team-inspired designs and options for hardcore cricket nerds. Their collection is a must-have for the true cricket enthusiast. Welcome back to Wagon Wheel. I'm Jarrod Kimber. Rudra says, why did Sehwag stop getting Test hundreds outside of Asia after Adelaide in 2008? And what made him so successful as a batter? 2008. I mean, how much of that is just age? What, how old was Virender Sehwag in 2008? Yeah, gets to 30. Really, really interesting. That's an age where perhaps he started to slow down. He played a very high-risk game, right? And I don't think that necessarily means that in conditions that were favoring him, he might have struggled a little bit more. But you can certainly see how in conditions that weren't favoring him, there would be some certain issues there. Also, just very basic things of he only needs to slip slightly in conditions that don't favor him as much, and he suddenly becomes a much bigger target. The word starts to spread around as well. But I don't have any great answer to that. And whose bowling is better, his or Dan Lawrence's? I don't think Dan Lawrence is a particularly good bowler. I'd have to go back and, try and remember Sehwag's. I felt that Sehwag was one of those guys who, probably rightly, but, got to a certain point where bowling didn't really matter to him anymore. Perhaps he, like what happens to a lot of them, he just got a little bit older. I'm just trying to bring it up. So he bowled 3,700 balls, took 40 wickets, an average of 47. His record's a little bit worse than what I thought. I would say that Dan Lawrence to take 40 wickets feels like a bit of a stretch, but it's a different kind of age, and people play spinners a little bit differently, and they specifically play part-timers a lot differently than I think what would happen in those days. There's a reason we have less part-timers now than we used to, and it's because when they've done all the number crunching, it doesn't quite make as much sense to bowl a part-timer. So now when Lawrence is bowling, it's either absolute last chance saloon or the conditions are in his favor. There are probably times when Sehwag was bowling, just to rest people, it's the 70th over. The ball's not really reverse swinging. We've only got one other specialist spinner in our team. Can you bowl your overs out here? That really doesn't happen as much anymore. Fitness of bowlers has got a lot better. The way that we use them has got a little bit smarter. And that kind of part-time thing doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, it's I would think he was a better bowler. I'd probably prefer to face Lawrence than I would Sehwag. If that, I don't know why that's a new metric that we're using, but it is. James says, can you give me some examples of test teams that, in your opinion, had fairly ordinary talent, but overachieved due to brilliant captaincy and on or off field leadership? Well, I mean, everything New Zealand did to structure their team better, between 2012 all the way through to 2021, probably got the absolute most out of a talented group of players, but not, they didn't have the same level of talent available to them that Australia, England, India, South Africa, Pakistan might have had in that period, and yet they won the World Test Championship. So that's certainly a test team that went above and beyond. I think the New Zealand team, again, in the 80s is another really interesting one of probably outperforming their talent as a unit. New Zealand, Sri Lanka of the 90s essentially have two bowlers, right? Late 90s, two bowlers, and start to win test matches. It's very hard to win test matches with two bowlers, even if one of them's Murali, to do that consistently. And Arjuna obviously had a big play in that side of things. I'm trying to think if historically that's the case. I suppose you could say that England winning bodyline against Australia is a perfect example of a situation where not that they're an ordinary team, but they probably weren't as talented as Australia, and yet one theory sort of completely threw them off. I'm trying to think if there's any other teams. I feel like there's a Pakistan team that I'm missing, but I can't think of any sort of tactic. Pakistan, I think when Pakistan got really good a few years ago, it was on the back. I think Misbah changed the way that a lot of their cricketers thought about cricket. There was a version of professionalism that had come into the game that hadn't been there before. The push-ups at Lords and all that sort of stuff was Misbah saying, the fitness matters, guys. All these sorts of things. So I do think that might be another one. And when you look back at that side, they weren't a spectacular side. They were good, but I don't think that, did they have Wahab and Rahad Ali and they won a test match in England? They were not a fantastic test bowling side by any nature, and to come to England and beat them, even if it wasn't the greatest England side, is something. And they obviously had a lot of other success, got to number one in the world at that time. They were much better at home, and maybe they rode the glory years of Yasir Shah a little bit there as well. Niran says, what do you make of Jonathan Tront's explanation of them not being informed by the match officials about a net run rate situation? Isn't that the team management's job to figure that out, especially when most viewers at home knew what was going on? Okay, so I've been in this situation before. When you work for a team as an analyst, one thing that you have to keep an eye on is the net run rate. When you get to halfway through a tournament or a season or, whatever it may be, that's when you start to turn your eyes to it a little bit more. If you look at it and you realize it won't matter, it's not going to make any difference unless we tie a game or have a bunch of washouts. You probably don't. You just keep it behind you. But you do need to have it. So I know that we had one for when Scotland was playing the Netherlands. There was something that we had to win the game in some preposterously short period of time. And because of that, I remember making one up at that stage, and then perhaps I thought maybe then it was the UAE game. Yeah, so it might have just been the Netherlands game that I had to worry about it. But I had to set it up myself. I had my own spreadsheet that I made. I had to work out things like how you work out the decimal places and everything, because there are 6 balls in an over. And it didn't quite mathematically. I had to work out which way the ICC were doing it, just to be as careful as possible. But then at any stage, I could put in, the totals, the changing totals, and I could, have a look at that and tell our team what we needed to do in that situation. We ended up losing that game badly, partly because we were trying to win it, so brutally. It never occurred to me to ask the ICC how to do that, because why would they have a statistician at the ground whose job it was to do that? We would have had stuff on the TV, but we were in the UAE, and I wouldn't have had a TV screen in front of me. They would have had one back in the change room. But again, people are not using it for that sort of stuff. If I had it, and I'm trying to think, there might have been another game I had it for, maybe it's at Lucia, where there was a TV explanation of, I can't remember what the situation was in this, but yeah, it's the same as I had. I haven't used it in a while, but when I was an analyst, I also had my own version of Duckworth-Lewis. Now, the teams would give you all that sort of stuff. The ICC does give you all that sort of stuff. All the people who are running the tournament do give you that sort of stuff. But again, I didn't want to be given a Duckworth-Lewis calculation that was slightly wrong. I wanted to know exactly what it was at all times so I could have it on my computer. Laurie Colliver, the famous South Australian analyst and Fox Sports employee occasionally, and does he work for Seven as well? I know he works for everyone, Laurie. He gave me that years ago. So I had that. I'm making my own spreadsheets. So I don't know exactly what happened here, but I don't understand why they thought that information should be given to them, because that was never, when I was an analyst for a team, I always made sure that I knew exactly the situation myself. And I'd rather do the maths like in a situation like the Netherlands net run rate, I must have done the maths on that like 12 different times. I just kept doing it and kept doing it. I did different ways to make sure I would come up with the same answers over and over and over again. So I knew exactly that I was correct. Even if someone from the ICC, and that was an ICC tournament, obviously, and this one's not an ICC tournament. So I don't even know why there would be anyone from the ICC there to pass this on. But even if someone had handed me a piece of paper, I would have used that to match the two. And if there was a discrepancy, I would have gone back to the start and done it from scratch again. So I don't know what happened here. I didn't see the game live. I was following it. Shoyam was sending me messages, and Ari, I think, on our WhatsApp group, were going nuts over it. So I was kind of following that way. And obviously, I did hear Jonathan Trott's explanation. If this is what he thought was going to happen, that just sounds like to me someone who hasn't been a senior coach that often, which he hasn't. Like he was an assistant coach quite a bit, batting consultant, all these things. But the analyst should have been. I mean, no one ever asked me to do it. It was just something that I did on my own. And I would have assumed that most analysts do that and have that as a situation available to them at any one time. Why that didn't happen here, I don't know. And I can't tell you the full reasons. All I can tell you is that I would have had a spreadsheet available to me to put all the different numbers in at any one stage and be able to tell what that situation was. Richard says, are you surprised by how quickly India moved on from Shikhar Dhawan? It feels like in T20, he got really good around the time they discarded him. In ODIs, he was amazing for a long time before a little bit of poor form, and now he's out permanently. Look, I think that Shikhar Dhawan is the kind of player that they just created a lot of. And when they had to get rid of an anchor, he was the most disposable player that they had available to him. I don't think it helped that just as they were moving on from him, he suddenly started getting a lot better and being the sort of player that would have helped them beforehand. It's kind of a little bit maybe too late from that point of view. I think he's a very good one-day player. But again, if you look at the way that they want to play, I don't think his style necessarily fits in. He's a really interesting player, and I've done a big thing on him, Rudra, a couple of years ago on his T20 cricket. He's a really interesting player in that if he is your 7th or 8th best player, you're probably in a fairly good position as a team. But if you are the 7th or 8th best player and you start to get old, or other players come up, the team will move on from you fairly quickly. And I think in this case, they just thought that they had other options available to them that can do the same jobs. And that's probably fair. The old days of batting really slowly in the power play, chipping it around a little bit more, and then hopefully slogging once you get over 100 are probably gone. And that was Shikhar Dhawan's probably best ODI template. Having said that, he did change his T20 cricket, as you said. So perhaps they went too soon on him. I'm not sure. Bloody Bugger says, I started watching the Premier League because of how terribly cricket has been run. This meaningless Asia Cup is a perfect example. I realized that the exclusion of the working class of England in cricket is due to latter government decisions. But even from the early days, I don't think there is a cricket equivalent to West Ham, Arsenal that became huge. Did cricket exclude the working class even from the very start? Well, no, because the working class built the game. So no, it was a street game. It was a gambling game. It's really when Hambledon comes along in cricket where things start to change. They write the laws up, of course. They have the first books written about them. They essentially are lords before there is lords, despite the fact that Hambledon's a tiny little place in the middle of nowhere. That's when it really starts to become owned by the people. And look, by the rich people. I would say that there is a fundamental difference in the two sports as well. If you're an amateur football player, outside of being a goalkeeper, you're probably going to have to run a bit, right? Whereas if you're an amateur cricketer, especially in the 1800s, you could probably just use a really big bat and boss a bunch of underarm bowling around. And so it was perhaps a sport, and cricket has changed a lot since then, but it was certainly a sport at that stage, perhaps slightly for more lazy people who didn't want to work as hard. And look what they did in cricket. They basically made all the poor people bowl, right? I love it when I see an old amateur who's a great bowler, because you're like, yeah, power to the people. But it's very rare. There's a lot of them are batters. So I think that in football, that would just be a harder thing to hide yourself. And, could you be a non-playing captain? Which we had in cricket, right? We had guys who weren't particularly good at batting or bowling and still played in the top level of cricket, in first class cricket. Can't really do that in football, right? Again, it would be a harder thing to be able to sell. It's a faster moving sport, all these different things. So I think that, in that perspective, that was part of it. But there's no doubt between 1780 and 1850 that the amateur rich side of England really take over the game. It's not to say that there aren't professionals out there. You go and listen to Double Century. We talked about some of those early professional teams. Obviously there were professional tours to England, to Australia from England. There were teams that had fewer professionals, fewer amateurs, and everything like that. But you don't get those sorts of, even in Yorkshire, you go back in Lancashire, Durham went around at that stage. But those northern sorts of teams, there's always a strong amateur push within them, and even, so Yorkshire is probably the most famous of the teams that I suppose is more what you're talking about. But if I'm not mistaken, let me just find him. So Yorkshire is that sort of team that, we hear a lot about the mines and, the professionals that came up from Yorkshire. But if I'm not mistaken, Lord Hawke, so to make sure, was obviously a huge figure in Yorkshire cricket. So you can imagine Lord Hawke probably didn't do as much work in the mines as some of the other Yorkshire players had, would be my guess, without knowing his full background. But so there were slightly more working class teams, but the amateur thing was so strong at that point that, and I've just done a podcast with Raf Nicholson that'll be out in a couple of weeks. It was even stronger in women's cricket. So it really was an issue that cricket had to deal with. I think looking back, tennis had it as well. Rugby, obviously, rugby union certainly had it as well. So it wasn't just cricket. It would be unfair to say that. And football has grown very differently to every other sport in the world. I don't think there's even like a mini version of football. Like basketball is another similar kind of sport. It's very, very global and played by a lot of different countries. But I wouldn't say that basketball specifically grew in the way that football did. Certainly, it took basketball a lot longer from when international teams start really playing football to when international teams get decent at football. Seems to be a lot quicker than it was for basketball, where it does take a lot longer for that to happen. So certainly from that perspective, football is different to most sports, I think, in almost every way. Neron says, if a similar situation to the Sri Lanka-Afghanistan game occurs in the World Cup, where it is okay for a team to lose, but not by a large margin, is that a valid strategy to forfeit the game, or is there a fail-safe for that? I don't believe there is a fail-safe for that. I think if you want to see I don't know if the highlights of this game are online, but I will probably be trying to find them shortly. I remember watching this game live, which was the 1996 World Cup game between Australia and the West Indies. Is that the game where Michael Bevan and Steve Waugh purposely bat slow? Was it in 99? I'm trying to remember. I remember watching the game anyway. And they were essentially trying to gerrymander the results by batting really, really slowly. In fact, I'm just going to whip over to the comments if anyone can remember what that game was. But yeah, there's a game where Australia could have finished it in, I don't know, 30 or 35 overs, and Bevan and Steve Waugh just block and block and block for what felt like forever. Watching the game back, it was probably two of the slowest innings that either of those guys ever played, and intentionally, of course. And I think that's the only one I've ever seen in a World Cup that has been that blatant. But we've certainly seen teams do little things that are quite blatant before. I can't think of any. I can't think of any other situation where a team has maybe tried. I can't think of any situation where a team has tried to lose. I do think that will be something that we will start to see in the future. Here it is. World Cup. Found it. So I was working at the time, actually. I remember I was working in a factory. So West Indies, off their 50 overs, make 110 runs. Australia win that with 56 balls remaining. So Steve Waugh makes 19 of 73 balls, and Michael Bevan makes 20 of 69 balls. And my memory was that it was something to do with affecting, I want to say, New Zealand's net run rate. But I can't remember the full story off the top of my head. I'd have to go back in and have a look at it. So it has happened before. There isn't a fail-safe. The fail-safe, of course, is playing multiple games. The last round-robin games should be played at the same time to stop all these sorts of things to happen. What a real sport would do, to be fair, even real sports don't always do this all the way as well. But that's what you should be trying to do in proper sports is make sure that you can't have these sorts of silly situations. But sadly, that's not the sport that we live in. We couldn't possibly have 2 games at the same time or 4 games at the same time. Although, when the World Cup started, we used to have 4 games on one day. Anyway. And Vivek says, do you think that cricket will have a mic communication between the players on the field and the coaching staff? So we've already had that, Vivek. Bob Woolmer and Hunter Cronje tried it, and it was obviously banned. Or do you think the current methods of exchange of information work reasonably well? I mean, the current methods of exchange of information work terribly. So certainly, if you want that to be better, I think we have a unique situation when we essentially have an on-field coach, far more than I heard Mina Kimes saying the other day that the NFL quarterback is maybe the most contextual position in sport, whereas a cricket captain is even more contextual, right? Everyone who's around you is the reason that you are good or bad, even if we don't always look at it that way. And a quarterback is talking to their offensive coach when they're on the field. They're also off the field half the time, right? So lots of conversations in that way as well. Look, there's 2 ways of looking at it. Do we want the best possible decision made by the team all the time? Then I think your way of doing it would be much better. As someone who's been an analyst who's seen teams make mistakes, I'd love to be able to say to the captain, no, please don't do that. But we are then losing something that is really, really unique to cricket, right? That we have an on-field coach who makes strategic decisions. And yes, there's some off-field messages passed back and forward, but on a ball-by-ball basis, there's no way you can get that much information across. So it's a unique sport from that perspective. It just depends on what you like. I probably prefer, the more information that a captain can have, the better. But it does change what cricket is at that point, which is very, very fair if some people don't like that. Thank you again to everyone for those questions. Very much enjoyed them. Let us take a quick break on Uncovered, and then we'll come back and I'll see if there is anything in the room that I need to mop up. You're watching or listening to Uncovered with Jarrod Kimber. Have you ever considered a career in sports? If you're passionate about writing, creating videos, or podcasting within the sports realm, I have the perfect course for you, Fans with Laptops. It is based on my career of someone who broke into this job despite the fact that at the age of 28, I was parking cars for a living. Take advantage of all the mistakes I made, use your passion, and enroll in the course today. Express your cricket fandom with Bodyline t-shirts. Discover their extensive range of player-inspired tees, featuring cricket legends such as Murali, Warne, and Wasim. With team-themed designs and options for hardcore cricket nerds, they've got you covered no matter what your interest in cricket is. All right, let us see what we have in the chat. We don't have any super chats at the moment. So Mana says, which 2 players of a generation? of any generation could benefit from playing for the other country. Pajara to Australia. Career graph, legacy, and earnings would all be around the same or differ massively. Well, yeah, I mean, there would be lots of different. I mean, I won't get into the earnings because that one's a bit weird. Pajara to Australia. So where is? Yeah, if his batting translates to Australia, if he's going to make 20 of 120 balls over and over again, I think that makes more sense for a touring side. So his batting would have to transfer. The players that you're really talking about is, Colin Croft and Sylvester Clarke and Roddy Eswick and who are some of the other West Indian quicks I'm missing. Those sorts of guys. In India, it would have been, the third and fourth spinners of the quartet. Make a case that Adam Gilchrist would have played a lot more Test cricket had he played with anyone else, because he would have played well earlier when he was far younger. Stuart McGill, so you really look at those sorts of backup players, aren't you? That would have been very, very different. There's a really good India. Raidu is another one. Stuart Law, Martin Love. Perhaps even someone like Jamie Siddons. If you slot Jamie Siddons into New Zealand, he probably becomes one of their best batters of all time. So, yeah, I think there's a few different options from that perspective that would go across. That's usually what you're looking at. If you're looking for players who are in the team and would be better in other places, well, I mean, half the Asian seamers and half the Western spinners would probably quite happily switch over and have much better records if they could play in more helpful conditions. So I certainly think those things. Darren Lehman would have been a really interesting one. Darren Lehman probably was a batter who was at his best, perhaps in English conditions or Asian conditions, and played in Australia. So I think he would have been much better had he not been not that he was bad in Australia, but I think he was just better in those other places. So, there would be, I'm trying to think if there are any other like sort of obvious players that have those kinds of skill sets. I don't know, maybe someone like Neil Harvey is another one, who's a fantastic player of spin. But yeah, I think there's a lot that, in that way would be very, very changed. I don't know if Pajara would be one at the top of my list from that kind of perspective. Rahane would have been a really interesting batter in English conditions consistently, right, during a period where they struggled for those kinds of players. Would given him a whole new set of fans to complain about him. All right. Sean has come through with a super chat. I am too young to remember South Africa coming out of isolation. What did the world expect of them in their first couple of years? They were quite hyped up for the 92 World Cup, Sean. So that was the one where we knew they had all-round options. We knew that they had experienced county players. There was clearly I don't think anyone was massively worried about the talent. Kepler Wessels played in 92 World Cup, I think, for them. Was he back by then? I think he was. So they had some players that were well respected. So there was a thought that they would be handy. They probably slightly overperformed in ODI towards the overall hype, but I remember everyone thinking that there was something there when they came back in. And I think that was certainly the way that people looked at it. Test cricket, I suppose after that 92 World Cup, there was a thought process that they were a pretty good team. And that led the way to everyone sort of believing that, this was going to be a decent side. They, again, maybe slightly overperformed the hype. One thing I would say, Sean, is you've got to remember that cricket didn't exist back then the way it does now. So you can make a very big argument that I'm the first global cricket writer who wrote about all different teams professionally, consistently. And so back in 92, you had newspaper writers, and they're more interested, especially if you get the World Cup. The World Cup is slightly different because everyone's coming up to town. So, you have some interest in the teams, all the teams. But otherwise, you're only interested in the teams as they come out to play you specifically for test matches. So the World Cup is what I remember. That doesn't mean that people didn't think that they were a good test team as well. It just, what I would say is that it wasn't the way that the game was reported on at that stage. But there was a little bit of hype. I don't think anyone had them down. I think people had them down as a potential, what's the best way of putting it? I think people had them as a potential semi-finalist, but perhaps not, the level of semi-finalist that they got to, maybe exceeded a little bit. I'd have to go back and have a look at the odds, but obviously Australia, people would have expected Australia to do better. They would have expected West Indies to do better. So they would have been in a bracket slightly lower than those sides. Australia was in the middle of revolutionizing one-day cricket and had a terrible tournament. West Indies won the first two tournaments, should have won the third tournament. Not that bad in the fourth tournament. Still came to the fifth, and even 96, they still came with really, really strong teams. And so, I don't think anyone would have thought that South Africa was a better team than them. So maybe they were ranked around the fifth or sixth best time coming into that. That's my memory. But as I said, cricket writing wasn't really like that at that stage. So it would have been slightly different. Aditya says, you mentioned 4 spinners to do well in India, that they need more spin. In Australia, more bounce. How do you explain the success of Kumble and Harbhajan in India, both who had more bounce and no side spin? Firstly, there's a different way of bowling spin, Aditya, and thank you for your super chat, sorry, as well. There's specifically a different way of bowling spin in Australia. So if you watch Harbhajan getting more bounce in India, he's still attacking the stumps with that extra bounce. So if you go back and you have a look, he's bowling wide of the stumps and he's bowling this angle into the stumps. It's a very different kind of bowling. And then what he's hoping for is, because he is putting overspin on the ball, he's hoping for the occasional ball to take off and get a little bit of glove as well, but keeping the stumps in play. So it's a very different kind of bounce. If you look at Nathan Lyon, he's bowling very close to the stumps. He's bowling the ball away from the stumps a little bit and then bringing it back in. So he's bowling for a little bit of extra bounce, but he's looking for catches that slip specifically. And then when the ball rips and turns, he has the ability to either, perhaps get a bowled or an LBW, but probably not that many LBWs. Traditionally, the way he's bowled is slightly changed of recent times, but also then getting the overspin to be able to get, a little bit of glove or anything. But what I would say is, if you look at, I've watched Harbhajan Singh and Nathan Lyon bowl from side on, there's no comparison for the amount of overspin that the two men put on the ball. Harbhajan put a little bit of overspin on the ball, and for an Asian spinner, probably more so than most. Nothing, absolutely nothing compared to the amount that Nathan Lyon puts on. So there's a very, very big difference there. Anil Kumble didn't get extra bounce because of his spin, because he didn't put masses of revolutions on the ball. I think he got more bounce because he had a very, very tall action, and he was very upright when he came through the crease. The problem with Anil Kumble is that if you look at Nathan Lyon or Shane Warne, trying to think of, that's about basically it for about 40 years of Australian spinners. But if you look at the Australian spinners who are successful, it is a combination of the spin and the bounce. And I think Kumble's problem was that. The other thing that you need to factor in is that Australians are brilliant players of spin in Australia. And it is a different kind of playing spin in Australia than it is anywhere else. I've noticed, as someone who's moved from Australia to England, I play spin very differently in England than I ever did in Australia. And part of it is the way I move my feet, and it, the whole game plan and how I defend and everything else, especially where I keep my hands. All those things have changed quite a bit about the way I play spin in Australia to England. And Australians play spin in Australia brilliantly. So if you go through, I'm trying to think of someone else. There are probably people who've got even more bounce and even more overspin than the two guys you're talking about, who just didn't take a lot of wickets in Australia as spinners. And I do think a big part of it is because Australia's plays spin very well at home. The other thing is that the pitches, there's a big difference from saying someone gets some overspin on the ball and someone being a natural overspin bowler. And I think there's a huge amount of, Nathan Lyon has out-bowled Ashwin probably head-to-head in Australia over their entire careers when they've both been playing in Australia. No one thinks that Lyon is a better bowler than Ashwin, right? But Lyon knows exactly how to bowl spin in Australia. And if you think about it, when you're coming to Australia, how often do you talk about how the spinners need to change what they do and how they do it and everything else? And generally what happens is if you do hear that from a spinner, usually what they do is they try and bowl quicker. And that doesn't particularly help that much in Australia because it just sort of skids onto the bat and you play a little bit more like a medium pacer. And so I do think that it's such a different kind of art that maybe, and this is a really random thing to say, but if cricket was more professional, if you were going to Australia, what you would really be doing is looking for Australian experts in spin bowling and how to bowl there to help your spinners. And I've never heard of that happening before. Maybe McGill did it for a team who toured Australia once. And he's not exactly like other Australian spinners either, because he doesn't get any overspin. He's almost completely a side spin bowler, although that's more the case with the wrist spinners than the finger spinners in Australia at times. So yeah, it's a complicated issue. But I do think that, I mean, if you were to go back on it, I think the lack of lateral spin that Harbhajan and Kumble got in Australia didn't help them, because if you're talking about Nathan Lyon, you were talking about a combination of both of those things. It is the spinning the ball sideways and also getting overspin at the same time, which he probably would have had to have done in Australia, because if he just did one or the other, he wouldn't have made it through. In fact, if you look at Nathan Lyon and Will Summerfield, the New Zealand spinner who actually was brought up, bowling a lot in Sydney, played first-class cricket for New South Wales. The difference between the two of those is they both actually get a lot of overspin on the ball, but Lyon gets a bit of side spin with it as well. So I do think that it is slightly more different, a different way of thinking about it. Also, bowling at the stumps in Australia doesn't help as much, because I see a lot of Asian spinners come to Australia and they bowl stump to stump, because that makes sense. That's where you generally bowl. Graham Swan, not even an Asian spinner, bowling, attacking the stumps like they do at home. The problem is in Australia, you get extra bounce, and it means quite often you're bowling onto the knee roll or onto the hip. And I remember years ago watching English spinners come to Australia and just get milked to square leg all day. Whereas that shot is a little bit more dangerous on a pitch where LBW is an option. Great question, though. Great couple of questions there from Sean as well. Just let me see if there was anything else in the room. I think this is just Aditya just adding on to that last question, which I'll just say. Why did they take less question? Oh, now he's done it as a super chat. He's all over the shop. Aditya says, why were they good in India despite no side spin? So in India, you're keeping the stumps in play all the time. So you've always got a chance of LBW and bolt. And in India, you don't need to put as many revs on the ball to get the ball to spin, which allows you to bowl a little bit quicker. And because of that, if you're bowling a little bit quicker and you're only getting, let's say he's getting like an inch and a half of deviation, right? He's now doing that at a much faster pace. And so that inch and a half allows him to bowl a little bit quicker, a little bit more direct, as someone like Gareth Batty would say, or Bill O'Reilly would say. And at that stage, it's harder for you to react to. If you bowl quicker spin in Australia, everyone since Bill O'Reilly, essentially, outside of, a little bit of part-time success for Colin Milne, not quite a part-timer, but Michael Bevan, almost all the faster spinners in Australia have struggled because you can't get the purchase in Australia if you bowl quicker. So if you look at Australia's two most successful spinners since Bill O'Reilly, it's Nathan Lyon and it's Shane Warne. Both of them are, even for their eras, a little bit slower than other spinners, right? In Asia, especially in India, and you certainly get this in Sri Lanka. I'm trying to think of some of the other, maybe even Bangladesh would be another one. You can actually afford to spin the ball less because the pitch will do a lot of the work for you, right? So in that situation, what you're actually doing is you're bowling a little bit quicker, a little bit more direct into the surface, And you don't need to put as many revolutions on the ball. So the ball doesn't slow down as much as it goes through. Australia is almost completely the opposite from that perspective. So we see spinners, UAE was another perfect example of a place where you knew you were going to get a base level of spin as long as you put revolutions on the ball. So you could afford to be a little bit quicker. That suddenly brings in, you can't use your feet as much, right? When that ball spins the 1.5, 2 inches, it's now spinning at a much faster rate as well. So you're having to react to that. On top of that, think about especially Indian pitches, Sri Lankan pitches a little bit as well, but Indian pitches are famous for just almost falling apart at the end. If you're bowling really quick and it's slightly quicker through the air, which is more an Indian style of spin bowling. Not everyone. Bishan Beatty was a very slow spinner, but if you look through, there's a lot of Indian spinners who are just that little bit quicker all the way through history. Now, the ball keeps a little bit low, you're in trouble, and everything else. You're not being able to do that specifically in a place like Australia because you won't get any sideways movement for the ball. And also, the less revolutions you put on the ball in Australia, you won't get as much overspin or sideways movement, right? And so you're now bowling dead straight deliveries. Whereas if you go back to Bill O'Reilly and even some of the England spinners who had success in Australia, they could bowl a little bit quicker in those situations because there was uncovered wickets. The minute you move to covered wickets in Australia, the revolutions become absolutely the most things from that perspective. So yeah, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Follow up as well, and thank you as well from Aditya there on his 2 super chats. Last 2 questions. Rebel Wisdom says, when you talk about the wobble, one thing I don't understand is why it would take so long to invent. It seems like one of the most obvious ways to use the seam. So it didn't take that long to invent because from the first time anyone tried to swing the ball, they probably bowled a wobble ball. What we couldn't see is the slow motion of it to actually understand why it was successful and why it wasn't successful. Sean Pollock and Courtney Walsh certainly had wobble balls. And I would say all the way back through history, we would have seamers who probably bowled that delivery. It's the difference of Muhammad Asif and Stuart Clark and then Jimmy Anderson as they come through. We now have a super slow motion to be able to see not only the success and why it has success, and then the ability to be able to do that, but then the ability to be able to teach other people. Right. So everyone has always had that. The other big difference was, Rebel, is that this was a situation that for a very, very long time, cricket was a swing dependent. You need the seam to be straight for swing. So the wobble ball actually doesn't help swing bowling as all as we've seen. Swing bowling is struggling over the last couple of years because everyone is bowling the wobble ball. And it's hard to go between the two as well, as we've now also found out. So when bowling was swing dependent, you wanted the seam to be dead straight. As we've moved, and the West Indians helped this, and then obviously, Glenn McGrath and DRS and all these different things have helped move us towards seam bowling. Suddenly the wobble ball got more important. And I don't think it's a mistake that, that starts to happen, about 15 or so years after the West Indies get good. And it also happens to be the combination of the cameras. So I hope that one all makes sense. Juggling Geek says, we can keep it standing a long way back to modern pace bowlers. Will we start to see batters running bys to the keeper more often, like Bairstow and Anderson did in the Ashes? Yeah, I don't think wicketkeepers practice rolling the ball along the ground well enough in high pressure situations in training, especially on match days. Look, we've already started. And you could say it's been coming for a long time, 20 or 30 years of that happening. The further wicketkeepers get back, especially in maybe pitches like in Australia where there's an actual pace and carry, so you back even further again. I can certainly see that being an option for teams. I wonder if it is something that is actually slowed down a little bit by Mancats, because I do think you probably need to be running from almost the moment the ball leaves the hand to be able to do that. But I think in the future, it is a little bit like how catchers in baseball have to have a strong throwing arm to, is it second base? I think. I do think going forward, we might see teams looking for wicket keepers who are very good at the ability to do that. Of course, the other option is standing up towards the end for certain, maybe not express bowlers, but we're already seeing teams try a little bit more of having the wicketkeeper up. I know that's largely to do with more Test cricket of recent times, but will that be another skill? Can you keep up to the stumps for 88 mile an hour to 90 mile an hour bowler for a few deliveries? I don't know. Is the best answer. Also, slow balls make that even trickier, I would have thought, for the wicketkeepers. Drivet says, your opinion on extras by the fielding side. Oh, Drivet, I don't exactly know what you mean there, but you've sent a super chat, so feel free to expand on that. So I think there's been a movement that some people believe that leg buys shouldn't go towards the bowlers, for instance. That's certainly one. We used to have it that I don't know how many people know this, but it used to be that no balls didn't go towards the bowlers, which seems like the weirdest one, especially because wides went towards the bowlers. So yes, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by your question there, Drew, but thank you very much for asking it. But if you do get a chance to add anything else into it, I think that having done analysis on, and this might be slightly different to what you mean, but having done analysis on it, the teams with the most extras don't always lose games. And so if that's what you're thinking of, it's not as good a predictor for winning as you would think. And I think partly that is because there are a lot of teams who do bowl intentional wides towards the end to just keep the ball out of someone's hitting arc as much as possible. And so that's certainly a part of it. I think, though, that when you do see extras, it usually leads to sloppier teams, right? We have a look at England in the first couple of Ashes tests of especially the amount of, buys that were let through. You didn't need the whole thing about Bairstow dropping catches. You don't really need that if he's allowing as many buys. And also we look at buys slightly incorrectly. We look at them as a total. It really should be the amount of fumbles by a wicketkeeper that we are keeping. Because if you fumble it and you drop it at your feet and they don't take any runs, it doesn't count as a buy. And because they haven't hit it, it doesn't matter. But actually, that is a sign of bad wicket keeping. And the more information we have on all that sort of stuff does come in. So I do think that is I do think that is an issue overall when it comes to wicket keeping. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure what your question means, Druvit, but I'm fascinated by extras. And was more than happy to finish the podcast talking about them. Anyway, that's the end of Wagon Wheel. Remember, please go and subscribe to all of our channels. The one that if you subscribe to everything, like Jarrod, I've left you a review on iTunes, and I've subscribed to you on what's it called? Spotify. And, I'm subscribed to your main channel, Jarrod Kimber podcast channel. We really want to get to a point in the future where, there are multiple hours of a day where we have content going out there, live chats with people, the ability to get sponsors on that channel, but also super chats on that channel and everything else is what will eventually drive that sort of thing so that, we can make the podcasts out of the content that we are currently making and everything else. Druvit's he's just come back to us and he said, I did mean how much of a win predictor. Yeah, so it's not as big of a win predictor in T20 cricket. I haven't looked at it in one-day cricket, Druvit, and I haven't looked at it in Test cricket, but it's not as big a predictor in T20 cricket, because let's say you're playing a bunch of players who all just like to drag the ball from outside off to the leg side for sixes. Chances are you will have more wides in that game intentionally because you're trying to bowl as wide as possible to them. But it's a proper tactic, right? You're not trying to necessarily bowl wides, right? But you're trying to keep it as wide as possible in that way. So I don't think it predicts as much in that kind of way. But great question as well. But thank you for that. But yeah, Jarrod Kimber Podcast Network. We are working on a big series at the moment, and we had a big meeting for our World Cup stuff. We've got an absolute ton of World Cup stuff that we'll be working on before the tournament, and then also during the tournament as well. So stay here, and for as long as possible, we will be doing stuff. We don't know what our full World Cup plan is at the moment. I know a lot of people have been asking me about that. We may go back to the mood boards, which is like a live show about bunches of different topics that we did during the last T20 World Cup. It may be just our normal videos as well. But thank you to everyone for your support. And I will see you again next week when we come back for Uncovered.
This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager.
Join our new YouTube channel, Jarrod Kimber Podcast. Engage with live recordings or listen to the thought-provoking chats 4 times a week, exploring shows like Wagon Wheel, Uncovered, Footmarks, and Red Inker. They cover everything from fan questions, weekend stories, articles, videos, what's going on in cricket, and just anything we want to talk about when it comes to the bat and ball game. Want to have live chats with me or just connect with other cricket fans on Discord that also enjoy my content? Or a few AMAs. Maybe you want early podcast episodes or ad-free content or want to receive my emailer. You can get all of this on our Patreon, plus a little bit of behind-the-scenes stuff as well. Huge thanks to everyone who has supported us on Patreon so far. You are all part of this channel's success.